All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Sunny Galt, and I'm with Parents on Demand. And today's webinar is all about making money with your podcast. And this is actually part of a two-part series we're going to do. But today we're talking all about embedded ads. If you don't know what that means, stick around. We're going to define that for you and tell you all about that. And so if you haven't heard of Parents on Demand, let me tell you a little bit about us, because odds are if you're watching this, you're probably a podcaster and you may be a great fit for our network. So Parents on Demand is a podcast network, and we focus on content that is specifically geared towards parents. A lot of parenting podcasts are on our network, various types of shows, but we focus as a network on three main things. We help you market and promote your shows. That's the first thing. We help you with advertising, if that's something that you're interested in, monetizing your show. And then we also help out with the community side of things. And honestly, this is the reason that I started the network, is to help other podcasters connect with one another, learn from one another, grow, and it helps your show. It helps us as a network. And that kind of ties into the webinars that we do. So we do these monthly webinars about topics that we think you'd like to know more about. So let's go ahead and meet our special guest today. Heather Osgood from True Native Media is joining us. So Heather, welcome to our webinar today. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Sunny, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. And podcasts are my favorite topic. I could talk about them for hours and hours. So I'm excited to be able to share with your audience just a little bit about what we at True Native Media can offer, and a little bit about monetizing your show through ads. So I founded True Native Media in January of 2016, and I formed the company because I saw that the top 1% of podcasts had no trouble getting ads, right? All of those shows that hundreds of thousands of people are listening to have no problem getting ads on their shows. But then there's everyone else. And if you have thousands of people listening to your show, even if it's not hundreds of thousands of people, there certainly is a market for that podcast and an opportunity for you to have advertisers that align really strongly with your messaging on your podcast. And so I formed the agency to help podcasts really connect with those advertisers that they were looking for and maybe just didn't have either the time or the ability to secure on their own.
I love that, because we as a network are focused on independent podcasters as well. And you're right. There's that, the podcasts that are, bringing in tons of downloads, and it's easier for them to find advertisers. I know we'll probably dive into this a little bit more, but I feel like there's a group of us that are trying really hard, and we're producing good content, but sometimes it's hard to find eyeballs for that content.
Mm-hmm.
And so you and I think are a lot alike in the fact that we're really geared towards the independent podcaster, and we need people like that. So thank you for being part of our webinar today. And for those of you who happen to be watching live on the Zoom platform, we do have a Q&A button at the bottom. So as Heather and I are talking about embedded ads, if you have questions, go ahead and click that button and just type out a question for us. I'll keep an eye on that. And if I see questions starting to come in, we may address it during the conversation. We may wait to the end. It kind of depends on how things go and how we're doing on time. We are trying to keep this to an hour or less, but we do want to answer all your questions as well. So Heather, let's go ahead and dive into this. I think we have to start by just talking about terminology, because, to give everyone kind of a background, as Heather and I were preparing for today's webinar, what I found is that we were throwing out terms, and sometimes we were kind of not connecting on what actually that term meant, like what really is an embedded ad. And if you've never heard embedded ad before, the first time I heard that was actually through Heather. And I've always called them baked in ads. I've never liked that term for some reason. That does not work well with me. It sounds like a cooking show, or I don't know. It's like crazy. So Heather, let's start by talking about terminology here. What is an embedded ad?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that certainly is exactly where we need to start. And the concept of an embedded ad is that it's an ad that you record into your program. And that could be an ad that prior to the episode, you've recorded it and then you're going to stitch it in afterwards. It could be an ad that as you're going through your episode, you're reading it, or with a guest, you're taking a moment to say, hey, we're going to pause and highlight a certain company and a sponsor of the program. But it's any ad that you put in your program that is going to stay in there indefinitely. So if you publish your podcast today, and let's say you have an ad for Audible in that podcast today, if I pull up that episode next year or 2 years from now, I'm going to hear the exact same ad. So it's an ad that is truly in that episode and it's not going anywhere. And I know, Sunny, you are going to be doing a webinar coming up about dynamically inserted ads, but I think it's really important to talk about that now just so that we kind of understand what the differences are. So if you're an independent podcaster, chances are, based on your hosting provider, embedded ads are going to be where you're going to go because that's going to be the option you have. If you were interested in doing dynamically inserted ads, there are many, many platforms out there that could help you with that. By and large, dynamically inserted ads come through your hosting provider, though. And the concept of a dynamically inserted ad is that we are going to electronically insert the ad into your program. So you could create ad marks within your podcast. Let's say every podcast at minute 13, we're going to dynamically insert an ad, or at the beginning or at the end. So you create these ad markers, and then electronically, the computer program comes and it puts that ad in there. And then you can set certain parameters around how long that ad is going to be in the episode. Whether that is that you want the ad to be there for a certain number of downloads or a certain number of months, you can create those parameters. And so that's what a dynamically inserted ad is. And what we're talking about today is an embedded ad, which is an ad that is created just like the rest of your content. It is in there with your episode and it will stay in there indefinitely.
Okay. And I think you made an important distinction that not a lot of people understand. And that is, first of all, it is host read. So you would be reading the ad. And then also, it's not that those can't be pre-recorded. It's not like you got to kind of come up with a different thing all the time. It's just that when you're editing your episode, if you had something that was pre-recorded that you did, you just piece that in at whatever time. So, I think a lot of people think it's got to be recorded live and, you got to come up with different things all the time. From your perspective, though, in talking to advertisers, do they have a preference when it comes to embedded ads? Do they make that distinction? Do they say, listen, I want it fresh each time, just to make sure there's some variety there? Or do they say, no, it just needs to be host read and needs to stay within the episode?
No, that's a great question. So I named the company True Native Media for a reason. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term native media, the concept of native advertising is it's content that it's an advertisement that feels like content. So none of us like ads, right? I've been in advertising my entire career and I wouldn't say please give me more ads. That sounds great. I just want more ads to listen to, right? None of us like ads. But how many of us like to buy things? I like to buy things. And if you're going to hear about a really cool, awesome new product, aren't you interested in that? And the power of podcast advertising is that you as the host have the ability to select companies, to select products that you really like, that align well with who you are as a person and the message that you're communicating. So when you authentically communicate that message to your audience, chances are they're going to be interested in the product just like you are. So when we can create ads that don't feel like content, number one, as a listener, I prefer to listen to those. And number two, from an advertising perspective, they're going to be a lot more effective. So getting back to your question, it is more powerful if you can do a fresh read every single time. So that doesn't mean, like you said, that you have to have the pressure of, I'm right in the middle of my episode, I'm either interviewing a guest or I'm in deep conversation with my co-host, and now I have to totally change gears and focus on this advertiser. But if you can do that, number one, awesome, that is great. If you can't do that, if you want to pre-record the ad and then stitch it in, that works really well too. But I really do encourage our podcast to do a fresh cut each time, because as a listener, if you're like, gosh, I heard this story last week about how, she loves these new non-toxic cleaning products, you're going to be like, I heard that already, and you're going to have a greater tendency to fast forward through the ad as a listener. And so what we're trying to do always, in my opinion, is create a win-win situation between the podcaster and the advertiser, to provide the advertiser with the greatest value possible. And the hope is obviously that the advertiser will reciprocate and provide you with great value in that partnership as well.
Okay. Now, when podcasters are doing this, do you recommend that podcasters say something in the beginning as it goes into the ad to let people know it's an ad? Because I know that's kind of been a thing, I think, with the FCC
Mhm.
about, you have to make sure that you tell people, when it's an ad and it's not just something that you're mentioning. And I think with host read ads, you can blur the line in a good way. You can blur the
Mhm.
line, like what we were just saying, if people feel like it's still part of the conversation and it's not, we'll be right back after this commercial break. Fast forward, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But do you encourage them? I know some people lead into it with music, or people simply say, okay, it's time for a quick sponsor break. These guys, we've used their product. We really like their product. So there's kind of an endorsement. How,
Mhm.
how do you recommend people do that?
I think that that's a great question. And in my opinion, if you're really interested in creating great ads for your podcast, I recommend listening to Gimlet shows. Gimlet, in my opinion, has really blazed the trail for creating great native ads. When I first started listening to Gimlet shows, I looked forward to hearing their ads because they do such a great job producing them. Granted, they invest hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce those ads. But as a podcaster, I really recommend listening to those ads and how they're constructed, because as a listener, when you're listening to the podcast, you never think like, is this content or is this an ad? Like, there's a very clear definition that this is an ad, but they've done such a good job in creating the ad that it feels interesting and intriguing and you want to listen to it. So absolutely, there are FCC guidelines and you do need to specify that this is a sponsor. So it's very important to make sure your audience is aware of that. That being said, in my opinion, if you say it's time for a break, what does that say to the audience? You might as well say it's time to fast forward, you
Right.
know? So I do think that it's not great to say like it's time for a break. If I had my way, I would have the podcaster start with a story. So I would have them say, hey, either listener or co-host, I have a story that I want to tell you about my kids last week and how difficult it was for us. And I hate dinner time. And don't you hate dinner time? And thank goodness for HelloFresh. Like, they saved my life. They made dinner time awesome. And oh, by the way, thank you that they are sponsoring our program. So
Right.
you are letting people know that they're sponsoring your program, but you're also leading into it in a way that makes people interested and engaged, as opposed to now it's time for our sponsored message, which, so,
Yeah.
and I would say, that being said, most people do lead in with, this is our sponsored message, or this is, time for a break. But if you can think about creating your ad content differently, number one, your advertisers will get better response, which means they'll want to come back. And number two, your audience will be more interested in listening.
Yeah. As you were talking, it reminded me of a show that I listen to that's Monday through Friday, and they have embedded ads, and they do rotate their ads, which we'll probably get to in a little bit. So it's not the same. I think they've got 3 spots in their show. So one's
Mhm.
like right after they do their intro, and another one's like halfway through the show, and then there's another one that's like 3/4 of the way through their show. But he does exactly what you're talking about. He includes a story because he's passionate about his products that
Mhm.
he represents. So he's got stories that go along with it. He uses the products himself. And there's always a new story. It just really goes along well with the show. And I'm always tempted to fast forward, but I'm like, what's he going to say today? Even from a producer standpoint, since I produce a lot of
Mhm.
podcasts, I'm always like, I'm putting on my
Yeah.
producer ears going, wow, we came up with another story about that product. But you're right. So I'm even someone that's tempted to fast forward, and I'm like, I just want to see how he's going to do it this time.
Yes.
And it
Yeah.
works, and he gets great conversions as a result. I know we're going to talk about that in a second too. But let's go through, because a lot of people may be watching this going, okay, but how does this whole process work? So
Mhm.
start us out with, so you have a podcaster come on board that's represented by you guys. What, at least through your agency, how does it work? How do you find the advertiser? Let's start with that.
Mhm.
What's that
Yeah.
process?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of different types of advertisers in the podcast space. There are a handful of advertising agencies that specialize in working with companies that just want to do podcast advertising. So those agencies represent companies like Casper Mattress and Blue Apron and Harry's Razors and ZipRecruiter. All the ads that you hear all over the place, those agencies work with those companies.
Okay.
And so True Native Media works with these advertising agencies to help facilitate that relationship. Most of those agencies will not work directly with an independent podcaster. They're looking for a middleman like True Native Media to help facilitate the process. It also depends, though, on the size of your show. If you've got a really large show, they will work directly with you. But if your show is somewhere between, I would say, like 1,000 and probably 20,000 downloads an episode, they don't love to work directly with the individual podcaster just because it's a lot of work.
Okay. That was going to be my next question is why don't they want to do that? It's a lot of work. It's easier to work with someone that represents multiple podcasts and just coordinate with one person as opposed to 20.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. So that's why they prefer that. And so, hosting providers like Libsyn and Blueberry, companies like AdLarge and Midroll and Authentic, True Native Media, all of those companies work directly with these agencies.
Okay.
And for True Native Media, 50%, and it varies, it's usually between 40 and 50% of the buys that we negotiate are through these agencies. And by and large, the larger companies like AdLarge, Midroll, Authentic, Podcast One, I would say 99% of the ads that they sell do come through those agencies.
Okay.
And then there are all of the direct advertisers. Now, just as True Native Media is trying to cultivate the relationships with the mid-level podcasts, we also are really working to try and cultivate more direct relationships because there are lots and lots of companies out there who are very interested in podcast advertising, but they have no idea where to get started. They know very little about podcast advertising. And I have that conversation several times a week, like, hey, we've thought about podcast advertising, but we don't know how to create a campaign. We don't know what we should do or what it should look like. And so really those are the two buckets we put them in, the agency buys and then the direct advertisers.
Yeah. And we as podcasters have people reach out to us through our website. I have people reach out even for Parents on Demand on a regular basis. Could those people, if you were representing them, could you forward them information, be like, hey, this person just reached out to me, but I'd really like you to handle that. I'm focused on content. Have you ever done that for people you represent?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, and for True Native Media, and we can talk more about this if you'd like, but we don't specify that a podcaster cannot do their own buys. So some agencies, you're not allowed to sell any advertising on your program. Once you sign up with them, they handle 100% of the ad buying on your podcast. True Native Media allows for the podcaster to sell directly if they would like, because, if you have an advertiser who comes directly to your site and says, hey, I want to buy ads, do you need someone to negotiate it? Depends on your schedule. Yeah. But we certainly have a good percentage of podcasts we work with that are like, I don't want to deal with this. Like you negotiate it, you work all the details out and just tell me what to do and what you're going to pay me. And so yes, we definitely do that.
Okay. So let's go back to the process. So usually do these ad agency or these agencies, do they reach out to you and say, hey, we're representing this brand. They want to advertise on podcasts. Are you constantly checking in with them? How does that work?
It's a little of both. So when I first started the company, it was me knocking on their door on a regular basis. And now that we have an established relationship, I get requests frequently from, hey, we've got this advertiser, they're looking for this kind of show. Can you connect us with that person? Or those podcasts. So we do get a lot of requests because of the established relationship. But at the beginning, just like anything, it's really you having to go out there and blaze the trail and make known that you're here and the podcast or the audience that you're providing.
Okay. So from that point, let's say they come to you and they say, okay, we're representing this company. Do you look at the podcast that you represent and go, okay, I think that would be a good fit? Or what is that process like?
Mhm. So the agencies we work with, they have a roster of all the shows we represent. So they at any time could go through and say, I've got this advertiser and I think that Once Upon a Crime is a perfect fit. And so they'll sometimes reach out and say, we want to run this advertiser on this specific podcast because they know the shows that we represent. But often they do say, I've got, like yesterday, I got a request. We have a new beauty company that we're working with, and we would like recommendations. Can you send us over your recommendations? We're looking for audiences over the age of 35. So, then I will look through our list and say, oh, these shows are going to be a good fit for that particular advertiser.
Okay. And do you typically go to the podcasters first, or what point do the podcasters get involved with this to say, I'm interested in that, or not so much?
Well, I think one of the things that is really, really important to mention is that you as a podcaster need to really believe in the product, because we are talking about host-read ads. If you don't like a product, that's going to come across. And so I really always caution people away from endorsing a product, even if you're kind of lukewarm. If you're like, I don't know about that, or I don't know if I really believe that, then I would recommend that you not do the ad, because what's going to happen is the advertiser is not going to get the results, because you're not going to have the enthusiasm or the real belief when you do the delivery, and it's not going to go anywhere. So my intention always is that the advertiser comes out of the experience going, oh my gosh, that show is phenomenal. Like, we want to run more ads. The other thing with the agencies is that when you do well with one ad campaign, then they're like, oh, that show always performs, and they put more ads on your show. So you first and foremost really need to make sure you believe in the product that you're endorsing. And I have had many cases over the years, which I love, of, people, podcasters will get samples of product and they'll be like, oh, those bars were awful. Like, I cannot endorse that product. Or you just don't like the product. You're not interested in endorsing feminine hygiene or hair loss or whatever. So if it doesn't resonate with you, don't take it on. So there's always an option for us when we go to the podcaster to say, what do you think of this product? What do you think of this company as an advertiser? But we don't typically ask the podcaster if they're interested in the advertiser until the advertiser says yes. And the reason is that podcasters are excited. They want advertisers on their program. And I found that when I first started, I would vet all of the podcasts first, and I would say, what do you think of this product? But the minute that I did that, the podcaster heard, oh, they're coming on as an advertiser, when in fact, I didn't actually have that, that company sold on them yet. So we sell the company first. Once the company says yes, then we go to the podcaster and say, what do you think? And if it's not a fit, then we can find another podcaster for the advertiser. And it helps the process.
Yeah, for sure. When it comes to testing out products, do companies let podcasters test a product before a commitment is made? Because my experience has been you sign on and then they send you the product and you're like, I don't like the product. What do I do?
Yeah. Well, so what I always tell podcasters is that if you think you're going to like it, and I recommend going on the website, checking it out, reading reviews, and just looking at how the product aligns with your life. If you're like, gosh, I really just don't think that this is going to align with me. Like yesterday, I had an inquiry from a loan company. And so I had vetted a few shows because they said, hey, we're interested in running ads on these different podcasts. And I have had some that have come back and said, no, I'm not interested. If you're not like, I'm an anti-debt person and a loan company comes and asks you to advertise, that's an easy no. But so I would recommend look at their website, read reviews. And then if you get a product and you really don't like it, even if you're committed to the ad buy, I still think that you should back out and, just tell the company, look, I really thought that this was going to be a different experience, but it turns out that, and obviously if you're dealing with the company directly, you're not going to want to call and be like, I hated your product. But, I think that it is really important to be authentic and truthful about whether or not you like a product.
Okay. Now, what are advertisers typically looking for in podcasts? I know you said that a lot of times they have your list of shows that you represent. Is it all about the downloads? Because as podcasters, we get so obsessed with download numbers. And, a lot of that I don't know, it can be kind of frustrating when you're like, but it's a really good show. And we try to make the point, and in a lot of cases it is really true, that we have a very engaged audience. So even though there's 1,000 downloads per episode or whatever, these people, they trust me. We try to, kind of get advertisers on that way. But what are they looking for when it comes to agreeing to work with a podcaster?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there are twofold. So number one, numbers are important, and anyone who tells you that they're not, I think is lying to you. And when you look at it, you just have to think of it as a math equation. So every company out there has target goals for their cost per acquisition. How much is it costing them to get a new customer? And if they can't make that CPA goal work, then they're not going to buy ads from you. They have to make it from a business perspective, and companies advertise because they want more customers. Now, without getting into, we could talk on and on about the different types of ads, and without getting into that, most ads placed in the podcast space right now are direct response ads, meaning we've all heard the promo codes, the unique URLs. The advertiser is looking for that unique URL or that promo code to be used a certain number of times, so they can say, oh, well, we know that this promo code was used 10 times. That generated X number of dollars of sales. Each of those customers is worth X number of dollars to us. So this was a winning campaign, or this was a losing. So, they're going to be looking at that, and that is important to consider. So I think that there's both sides, right? And I hate to tell people the numbers don't matter, because they do. And I always crack up, because I can't tell you the number of requests I get from podcasts a week that are, inquiries like, hey, can you represent my show? I've got 100 downloads. And no, we can't. 100 isn't going to move the needle for an advertiser.
What is going to move the needle? Where is that starting point? Everyone wants to know, so I'm just going to ask the question.
When I started the company, I started with 1,000 downloads per episode. The other thing that's super important as we're talking about embedded ads is that we're looking at how many downloads you're receiving per episode within a 30 to 45 day period. So oftentimes I will talk with podcasts and they'll say, oh, well, I'm getting 10,000 downloads a month, which is great. But each of their episodes is only maybe getting 1,500. All of the other downloads are coming from back catalog. And when we're talking about embedded ads, if I download your program today and there's an advertiser in that program for the first time, I'm going to hear that. Well, all of the other downloads that happen from back catalog back catalog episodes are very unimportant or unrelevant to the advertiser, because they're not in any of those episodes. And so you have to realize that the advertiser is just looking at how many downloads you're receiving per episode within a 30 to 45 day period. So that's first key and important, especially when you're talking embedded. Now with dynamic ads, there is an option to insert ads into back catalog. And when you have your dynamic conversation, I'm sure you guys will cover that. But so that's important to look at. For me, I have found that really the magic starting number is about 5,000 downloads per episode within a 30-day period. It makes sense for True Native Media to represent that company and help make the connections. If you're selling your ads directly and you're not working with a company like True Native Media or AdResult or AdLarge, then you can have fewer, but as we are only taking a percentage of that sale. And when I started, I was like, sure, I can make $10 an ad. That sounds great. But really, you can't. Okay. So we have to get to a certain number that we're making on an ad to make it worth our while. I really like shows that are between 5,000 and 50,000 downloads. And I know that's a big range, but I have found those shows do have a higher engagement level with their audiences. And they're easier to sell, because if you get too high, then we're talking thousands. Joe Rogan is $18,000 an ad on his program. I mean, it's not easy to sell an $18,000 ad.
Yeah.
So, there is like a sweet spot that works really well, at least for what we're trying to do in matching with those kind of mid-level companies.
Okay. So speaking of numbers, now what can podcasters expect to be paid? There's some sort of ad share going on here, right? So what does that look like? And what can you tell us? What do you feel comfortable telling us as far as, is there a CPM? Do you go by cost per thousand listens? How do you determine that?
Yeah. Well, so we base on our pricing on a CPM model, which is cost per thousand. And I like to clarify that it really is a flat rate. So we're using the CPM as a guidepost to determine the price. And currently we're at a $30 CPM. And when you talk to some companies, they're like, oh my gosh, that's so high. And then I talk to other companies that are like, oh, well, we're charging a $50 CPM. So somewhere between 20 and 50 is where the CPM lies. It does have a lot to do with your audience. And one of the things that I wanted to touch on is that your influence is also really important. If you are someone, and my goal is to really help move the podcast ad space from a dollars not a dollars exchange, but right now it's here's one spot and that spot costs X number of dollars. And really it is just like buying radio ads. And my goal is to move us out of that space and more into the influencer space. So you as a podcaster are an influencer. You have an audience of people around you, especially if you have a large Instagram following or a great blog that you've got going or another platform. You are an influencer. And the thing that's so cool about influencers is that we can't put a price on that, right? Like, we've got a new podcast that's a couple of actors from General Hospital. They're going to have a certain level of influence that they're with their audience that someone else isn't going to have just based on who they are. So my goal is to really try to move us into that influencer space. Now, that being said, you as the podcaster, what can you expect? It totally depends on what it is that you create. If you're selling direct yourself, you can create all kinds of different packages. You can, have those podcast ads and maybe social posts and mentions on your website or your e-newsletter. There's a lot of opportunity to create packages for advertisers. If you're working with a company like True Native Media, that is going to be that middleman, we are going to take a percentage, and that percentage can range greatly. I've talked to podcasters that pay companies anywhere from 50 to 60% of the, rev share. A lot of times if you're with a network, the network's going to take a percentage of that as well, which they should because they're helping you in a lot of other ways. If you work with True Native Media, we take 30% of what we sell. The other thing that we do that can be a little different than other companies is that we don't charge a fee to work with our podcasters. We just charge that 30% of what we sell. So if we never sell anything for you, it's not costing you anything. But when we do negotiate that buy, that's what we charge.
Okay. So let's go back to our example of a podcast, or a company wants to advertise on a podcast. The podcaster gets the product, likes the product, and is interested in pushing forward. What happens next? I'm assuming we have to create an ad, and how does that work?
So usually, because these are host-read ads, and I do want to make the caveat, because we are talking about embedded ads, 90% of those I would say 99.9% of embedded ads are host-read ads. They don't always have to be endorsement ads. They can be, and there can be those advertisers where they say, hey, I'm not going to give you a sample of the product, so I don't expect any personal experience. You're still going to be reading the ad, but you maybe don't necessarily need to endorse the product. Okay. Most ads are going to be endorsed. And so what you will receive is what we call talking points. So they're going to say, you need to hit these 4 or 5 points in your ad read. We want the audience to know that we, source all of our products from organic plants, that we only work with fair trade, that we, have monthly specials. So, they're going to create these things that they want to make sure you're communicating to your audience. So you'll get those 4 or 5 talking points, and then you'll usually get a call to action. Go to this website today and save 15% on your first order, or get the first first meal free or what have you. So you're going to have some sort of a call to action along with usually your unique URL that you are going to want to mention, make sure that your audience knows, because the advertiser will be tracking all of the results on whether or not your audience is going and using that code to make their purchasing decision.
Okay. And then how long are the campaigns usually, at least for embedded ads?
That is such a great question. It is all over the place. I wish I could give you a number. There are, with the agencies, they do a lot of testing, which drives me batty. And what I always I'm challenged with is that the agencies have a certain agenda. The other thing I always like to remind myself is that I have a very small view of the entire campaign. So they have a bird's eye view of the entire campaign. And something that's important to think about is that the average podcast listener listens to 7 podcasts per week. And so if you are an advertiser going into the space, you're not just looking at ads that are on one podcast. If you have ads on many podcasts, because someone needs to hear about your message 7 to 10 times before they make a buying decision. And so we are not necessarily looking at trying to get all of those impressions from one podcast. And so if an agency will have lots and lots of ads on different podcasts, assuming you're going to hear their ad on how I built this and, the hardest, longest hour. I think I got that wrong, but
Right.
they're gonna hear their ad in multiple locations on multiple podcasts. But so that's one thing to consider. That being said, a lot of the agencies will test out with 1 to 2 ads. From a marketing perspective, I think that it's insane. I mean, if I've never heard of a product before and I hear the ad, once or twice, chances are I'm not going to make a buying decision. I don't know enough about the product. But those tests do happen. Now, I always think it's really important for us to look at brand awareness. If it's a company like Ford, you don't have to say like, what is Ford? What do they do? Never heard of them, So, I mean, you can hear 1 or 2 ads from a company like Ford and it can be powerful. But then there are other companies where you're like, I've never heard of Zumba Love. Like, what is that? What does that mean? And I'm going to have to hear more ads about that product before I make a buying decision. So agencies will frequently place very small test runs to see how it goes. And if it goes well, they'll place more ads. With the direct buys, we do have a minimum, and that minimum is typically about 5 ads. And we encourage our direct advertisers to buy about 8 different ads. One of the most fascinating conversations I have had in the last year is with a company that has been doing podcast ads for 10 years. And they said that they get a 200% conversion on podcast ads, that it's the best advertising they've ever done, but it typically takes them a year before they start to see results.
Wow.
I know. It's pretty amazing to me. So I just think that it's one of those things where most companies are not willing to make that sort of an investment because it's not a proven medium for them yet. But as we're looking at the longevity of the industry, it's definitely there. And in my opinion, you have to have enough frequency to give your audience the opportunity to really make a buying decision.
And where are these ads typically placed within an episode?
Yeah. So, there are 3 different ad placements. There's the pre-roll, there's mid-roll, and there's post-roll. I have not ever sold a post-roll ad, and I certainly wouldn't recommend starting with post-roll ads because just as a listener, when you get to the end, you're not going to stay and listen to an ad at the very end of a program. So mid-roll is the most popular ad placement, and the reason that is a popular spot is because research has kind of shown that if a podcast is going to start out with ads, and especially when podcasts are very formulaic, when you listen to an episode and it always follows the exact same cadence. If you start a podcast and like I'm a big Tim Ferriss listener, Well, I know the first 6 minutes of his podcast are ads. So
Yeah.
even though I sell ads, I will frequently fast forward through them because I've heard about them. And he does do a lot of the same advertisers over and over. And so knowing that the first 6 minutes of the podcast are ads, you're more likely to fast forward. Um, the thought process is that when the ads fall in the middle of the program, that you're already engaged in doing something, right? So imagine you've got your phone, you're going to be listening to a podcast, you push play, you're right there, you know, the first 6 minutes are ads, you fast forward, push play again, and now you're washing dishes or folding laundry or going for a walk or driving. You're less likely to stop the activity you're doing to fast forward through the ad, which is why it makes it more effective.
Yeah.
Pre-roll ads can kind of fall into two categories. You can have an ad that starts at the very beginning of a podcast. So, you know, the very first thing you hear is, you know, we want to thank ZipRecruiter, our sponsor. And if you're looking to fill a job, go to ziprecruiter.com/, you know, wonderful, and, you know, get this special offer. So there are those, and that is a true pre-roll ad. And then there are pre-roll ads where maybe you welcome your audience, you do your intro, you talk about how your week's going great or you've got something special planned, and then you roll into the pre-roll ads. That is my preferred placement because, again, I think it's much, once people are engaged in listening to the show, even if it's within the first 5 minutes, they're less likely to fast forward than if it's at the very beginning.
Okay. And does the length of these ads, does that vary as well? I've heard pre-rolls that are, like you said, much shorter, like 10, 15 seconds. And then you may have a mid-roll that's 60 seconds. But what do you find with embedded ads?
Well, you know, it's great if you can tease the advertiser at the beginning. If we can give the advertiser multiple impressions throughout the program, that's great for the advertiser. So you can start the podcast by saying, and there's one show I listen to, I think she does a great job because she teases the advertiser at the beginning with like a 10-second read, and then she'll do a 60-second mid-roll ad. So if you can tease the advertiser at the beginning, it's great for them, and it's not a negative for your audience. And then so then you could do a 60-second mid-roll. I would say most ads are going to fall between either 30 or 60 seconds. It depends a lot on the format of the ad. And one of the things that I have experienced is, number one, often you're given quite a bit more copy and talking points than are comfortably fit within a 60-second period. So just FYI on that. Number two, most of them are going to be longer than 60 seconds because if you are telling a story, you know, it's going to take a little longer than a minute usually. But one thing I would caution podcasters about is being mindful of the length that the ad does go, because I have had advertisers who have asked that an ad be redone because it was too long. And so I have been told that 2 minutes is kind of the sweet spot for an ad, and that if it goes longer than 2 minutes, the returns actually diminish because, in my opinion, I think the audience is like, all right, we've heard enough. Like, we don't want to hear any more about ZipRecruiter. Like, you know, so you have to be mindful as a podcaster. I think a lot of times podcasters think, I'm going to give this advertiser everything and I'm just going to make this ad a 10-minute ad. Well, that's not really what they want either. You know, it needs to be concise, interesting, and, you know, to the point. So,
yeah. Or your audience doesn't want, like you said, your audience doesn't want to listen to that either. You know, it's interesting. So I worked with an advertiser who came to us and said, we only do 2-minute ads. And I had never done anything more than 60 seconds, give or take. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, let's chat about this on the phone, because the format of my shows was, you know, we weren't doing embedded ads. We were doing the insertion ads. And so it wasn't going to be me talking to someone else. It's just going to be my voice for 2 minutes. And I tried to talk to him. I was like, I know this may work. And honestly, we didn't have the conversation. Are you used to working with people that have embedded ads or co-hosts or something like that, where you can make it more of a conversation? So my pitch to them was, let me interview someone, from your company. And so they found someone that had used the product, benefit from it, and could talk about it.
Mhm.
And so we turned it into kind of a little case study. It did end up being about 2 minutes,
Mhm.
but it was so much more interesting for my audience to listen to. I was like, they're not going to just listen to me talk to you about your product for 2 minutes. Like,
Mhm.
you're not going to get the return on investment. They're not going to listen to my episode. It's totally not going to work.
Right.
But we worked together to kind of come up with something that worked for both of us, and it ended up being successful. So
Mhm. Mhm.
they may have, advertisers may come to this thinking they want one thing. And I think it's always important to go
Yeah.
back to, well, what's going to work for the show too? It has to be
Yes.
helpful for both parties, or
Right.
it's not going to be a good fit. They're not going to come
Right.
back, or you're not going to want them back.
Right, right, exactly. And the other thing that I would really advise podcasters to think about is how much time do you spend planning the content for your show? I mean, hopefully you spend a while, and if you could, approach the advertisers in the same way, and like really give that some consideration. How could I make this ad read really successful for them? And like interviewing someone is great, right? Like that's so much more interesting than I just am going to talk about this product because they're paying me to do it. Like
Yeah.
nobody wants to hear that. So if
Yeah.
you can make the ads just as creative and just as engaging as the rest of your content, it's I hate
Yeah.
saying it again, but it's a win-win. Like
Yeah.
that's what we're really looking for.
All right. So I want to give some information to people out there that are listening to this, or like, hey, I may want to give this a go. When
Mhm.
you look at shows that would be good fit for this, I know we talked about having minimum of 1,000/5,000 downloads per
Mhm.
episode.
Mhm.
What else are we looking for here? For example, are you looking for shows that have a specific kind of format, or are there any deal breakers for you? Like, you don't work with these kind of shows? And I know this may change agency to agency, but just from
Mhm.
your personal
Mhm.
perspective, are there
Mhm.
deal breakers or like categories you're like, I know I can't sell your show? There's just no way.
Yeah. 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 Well, so for True Native Media, like I said, we've been in business for over, 2 years now. And when I started, I was like, I'm going to focus on these specific categories of podcasts. But then people, someone would come to me. The first one was cars, which I'm like not a car person, but I got a handful of car shows that were like, hey, can you represent us? And I was like, sure, why not? Cars, that sounds great. You got a lot of downloads. Yeah. And then it's like, oh, and sports, and oh, this and that. And pretty soon I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got all of these different shows. And for True Native Media, it makes a whole lot more sense for us to sell a bundle of shows. Like I'm not looking to place one advertiser with one podcaster, like I want to be able to sell multiple podcasters to an advertiser. And so what we have decided as an agency is that we are specializing in female skewing, female lifestyle podcasts. I'm passionate about those podcasts. I like to listen to them. And I'm also excited and passionate about the advertisers that I get to partner those shows with. And so really podcasts have been very male dominated. And so our goal as an agency is really to help the female segment, both as podcasters and advertisers, and, really make that match. So that's what we're specializing in. And I have found that typically every agency is going to have like a specific bend, there is always jokes about, the different agencies. And last year at Podcast Movement, somebody had said something about like, if you were going to assign like a high school persona to these different agencies, who would they be? And, like some of them are really like the jocks and like all of the sports stuff. And some of them are, the theater group. And so, just like looking at and I think it's important for you to make sure that you're partnering your podcast with a company that's going to represent you well, that's going to bring you advertisers that you're interested in. And also, bring some added value. Are there opportunities for cross promotions on different shows, or things like this webinar? What is that company really bringing to your podcast beyond just advertisers? So I think it's important to look at the fit. When we talk about content, I mean, we all know podcasts are all over the board. I do think that there are, some instances where if your content is, a little bit out there, or a little bit too explicit, or a little bit too over the top, that there can be some red flags for advertisers. That being said, I wouldn't say that it's been a huge deterrent. There are some cases where the advertiser will say, we do not want to be on any podcasts that are labeled explicit. But I would say maybe 1% of the advertisers we've talked to have said that. And then there are, companies where they're looking for explicit, like I had at one point, somebody's like, do you have any like kind of degenerate type podcasts? Because that's the audience we're looking for. And I'm like, I don't know. I've never really used that as like my measuring stick. So, I mean, there are all people for all shows. So it just depends on who you are and what you're looking for.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about embedded ads versus digital ads and get when I say digital ads, but digitally inserted ads. And we talked about that at the beginning of our webinar, but I want to circle back to that to get your perspective. And we'll do the same thing next month when we talk to someone who represents the digitally inserted ads. But this is like a big question that a lot of people have. And like you said, I can even tell you from my personal experience, when I started doing ads, I did embedded ads because like you said, you don't need technology to do it. I was working one-on-one with people. I was going to baby expos, jotting down information from marketing people, calling them up later, emailing them, and doing one-on-one deals. And all I had was, I'll record it directly into the show and all that kind of stuff. And then I later switched to do the digitally inserted ads. But I want to talk about, from your perspective, the difference between the two. So what would you say are some of the advantages of doing an embedded ad over a dynamically inserted ad?
Sure. Well, so from an advertiser perspective, embedded ads are, in my opinion, the best form of advertising out there, because if you think about any ad experience that you as a consumer have had, those ad experiences are typically very short, right? So we're on Facebook, we see a Facebook ad, we see it, and then it's gone. Yeah, maybe we're going to see it again, but if we're seeing it a second, third, fourth, fifth time, that advertiser is paying for it, right? So every time you see a Facebook ad, the advertiser is paying for it. Every time you make a Google search and you see a Google AdWords ad come up, that advertiser is paying for it. When you hear a radio ad, when you hear a TV ad, when you buy a newspaper, all of those ads, they're kind of like a one-use thing, and the advertiser is paying for them every time. Podcast ads are, when they're embedded in the podcast, you will have all of the downloads that happen within that 30 to 45 day period. And that's how we're pricing that ad, is how many downloads you're getting in that period. But there are going to be a ton more downloads that are going to happen to that episode that the advertiser is not paying for. So really, there's a very strong long tail with embedded ads that is so important to look at. And I have had several conversations with advertisers over the years where it's like, well, gosh, the first 30, 45 days, I didn't really see the results I was looking for. But then now we've seen after 3 months that we are getting conversions. And you as a podcaster can take a look at your downloads and see that, 80% of downloads typically happen within the first 30 days for an episode, but still there's that other 20%. What happens when you publish a book and all of a sudden you're way more famous than you were, or you've got a bigger following? People are going to go back, they're going to check old content. So there's a lot of value to advertisers in having that ad be out there, because when I hear that ad next month, that was last month's episode, I'm not paying for that. So the only thing I can ever equate it to is magazines, right? So like a magazine that's printed today is going to be seen, most of the views are probably going to happen within 30 or 45 days. But then if I pick up a library or a magazine at the library, let's say that's an old one, I'm going to see that ad again. So really those are the only mediums I think that have that power. So from a sales perspective, when I'm out selling ads, I really preach that to the advertiser. And I say, hey, these ads are going to be in here forever, which is pretty crazy. And that can be a good and a bad. If you have a product change, if you have a special offer that you only want to run for a specific period of time, it doesn't work real well for an embedded ad. The other thing is most promo codes are going to last 6 months to a year, but there are cases where the promo codes won't work anymore. And so then you've got a promo code in your ad that's out there that, maybe isn't active. So that can be a bit of an issue, but you're still getting a lot of power. I recently, just a couple of days ago, there was an article on Forbes website that was written by the marketing manager at Ad Results, which is one of the larger advertising agencies for podcasts. And he said, based on their studies, that baked in embedded ads are 3.5 times more effective than dynamically inserted ads.
Wow.
So it's really important to look at the power of those embedded ads. And really what it is that when you've got that dynamically inserted ad, from a podcaster's perspective, it's better because you're only getting, the advertiser's only getting what they're paying for. But from an advertiser's perspective, embedded ads are more powerful. And we as a company haven't been really wanting to push toward embedded ads, dynamically inserted ads, simply because we don't see the demand there from the advertisers yet. We know the advertisers prefer embedded. And because we are working with the middle sector of podcasts, because your audiences aren't as large, there is a lot of additional value for the advertisers in having that long tail that you wouldn't receive if you did the dynamic insertion.
Yeah, I think the conversion, those numbers are astounding, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably do see repeat, people coming back to you for more advertising needs because those numbers are higher,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. What about, we talked a little bit about some of the downsides. The first thing that comes to my mind, we talked about this earlier, is your back catalog. In my case, I have 5 different podcasts that total 600 plus episodes across all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And my heart kind of cries when I think about not being able to advertise my back catalog. What do you say to people that are in that kind of situation?
I really think that if you have a back catalog with that many downloads, that you should look at dynamically inserting ads. And the other point that I want to make is that they're not mutually exclusive. And I don't want to get into too much of the technology behind it because it does get complicated. But you can dynamically insert an ad that is still embedded because it's inserted and it's not coming out.
Yeah.
So you could use the technology to insert a host read ad into your podcast and never remove that ad. And then you could also insert into all of your back catalog. So if you have a big back catalog, I do think that dynamic insertion is really very viable and something that you should consider.
Have you ever heard of people starting out doing embedded ads, fulfilling those impressions, which if you're just, I'm assuming you're just going by impressions and not working so much towards the long tail, but filling those impressions and then coming back later after those impressions are filled, removing. So that means going in and re-editing basically your episode to take out that ad and inserting dynamic ads in place of that. I know that's like a huge thing to do that takes up a lot of time, but I've heard of people doing this. Have you heard of that before?
I have, yeah. And I had a podcaster who did this and I didn't realize they were doing it. And so then I had to reach out to all the podcasts we work with and say, just reiterating, all these ads we're selling are embedded. They shouldn't be removed. Like they're meant to stay in here forever. So yes, there are people who do that. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it.
It's a lot of work. That's what I was thinking of. I was like, man, once I'm done with an episode, I'm going to put that baby to bed. I don't want to edit that thing again. But again, I think people are trying to get the best of both worlds. I think they realize, through these articles that are coming out, that embedded ads have a higher conversion, but I always feel like we need a cross between the two without all of that work. And I don't know what the answer is, but if you're willing to put in the time.
Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to take an embedded ad out after a year, I would think that it would be pretty safe to say like, yeah, you could take it out. But then like you said, to me, if you're really looking to monetize, go to your back catalog because you could insert a dynamically inserted ad at the beginning of your podcast. You're not going to be getting a $30 or $40 CPM on those. You might be getting a $15, but hey, if you're getting a $15 CPM, you're getting 100,000 downloads a month. That's great. So yeah. I mean, it all just depends on where you're kind of placing your value. And to me, I feel like there are higher value activities you could do beyond editing all of your back catalog.
Good advice. All right, Heather, thanks so much for being with us. How can people connect with you online?
Yeah, if you're interested in learning more about True Native Media, you can go to truenativemedia.com and find out more information. If you want to chat, we'd love to, chat with you about your podcast and how we can help you. You can also find us on all the social platforms at truenativemedia.com or True Native Media. So
Awesome. Awesome. All right. And then if you haven't checked out Parents on Demand yet, be sure to do that. We're at parentsondemand.com. But we're also on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all the places you are at Parents on Demand. And if you go to our website and you go down to the bottom, there is a section that's called Join Our Network. So if you want to learn a little bit more about us, there's a video from me welcoming you and all that good stuff. Go ahead and visit that. All right. Thanks so much, Heather. It was great seeing you today.
Thank you, Sunny.